On the night leading into July the 4th, Russia's second-largest city came under one of the most significant long-range drone attacks it has experienced since the start of the full-scale war. According to Russian officials themselves, not just Ukrainian claims circulating on social media, St. Petersburg and the wider Leningrad region were hit by what the city's own governor described as a large-scale drone assault. This is important to state plainly at the outset, because so much of what spreads in the first hours after an attack like this comes from unverified telegram channels, some sympathetic to Kiev, some sympathetic to Moscow, each shaping the story to fit a narrative. What follows is an attempt to separate what has actually been confirmed by officials on both sides from what remains rumor, speculation, or unconfirmed chatter, while also placing the strike in the broader context of where this war stands as it grinds into its fifth year. Let's start with what we know for certain. St. Petersburg Governor Alexander Beglov confirmed on his own telegram channel that the city's Kirovsky district, situated along the Baltic Sea, was struck overnight. He described the attack as large-scale, and he said that air defenses shot down 72 Ukrainian drones across the city and the surrounding region. He also stated that there were no casualties, and that the technogenic consequences of the strike, meaning the industrial fallout and immediate damage, had already been dealt with by emergency crews. That phrase, technogenic consequences, is fairly standard bureaucratic language used by Russian officials to describe fires, explosions, and infrastructure damage without getting too specific about scale. It tells us something happened serious enough to require a public statement, but it does not tell us how much oil was lost, how long the terminal will be offline, or what the real cost of the strike will end up being once insurance assessors and industry analysts get a fuller picture in the coming days. The target itself matters enormously here. The oil terminal in the Kirovsky district is one of the largest marine terminals in the Baltic used for transshipping petroleum products out of Russia. This is not some minor regional depot. Facilities like this are central nodes in Russia's ability to move refined fuel and crude byproducts from inland refineries onto tankers bound for international buyers, many of whom have found creative ways to keep importing Russian oil despite sanctions through what has become known as the shadow fleet. When a terminal like this gets hit, the damage isn't just physical, it's economic and logistical. Every day a loading berth or storage tank is offline is a day of lost export revenue, a backlog of tankers waiting in the Gulf of Finland, and pressure on Russian energy companies to find alternative routes for products that were supposed to move through St. Petersburg. This wasn't an isolated strike on a single target either. Leningrad Region Governor Alexander Drozdenko confirmed that drones also struck the Port of Vysotsk, a major Baltic Sea facility located roughly 170 kilometers northwest of St. Petersburg. Vysotsk is a significant multi-purpose port, handling oil, grain, coal, and liquefied natural gas exports. Drozdenko said that 72 drones were shot down over the Leningrad region as part of the same wave of attacks. Notice that both officials cited the same number, 72 drones intercepted, which suggests this may have been reported as a combined regional figure rather than two entirely separate defensive actions. Either way, the fact that Russian air defenses were engaging that many drones in a single night in the region around one of the country's most important cities tells you something about the scale and ambition of this operation. There's also the matter of Kronstadt, a naval base situated on an island just off the coast of St. Petersburg. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated directly on his own Telegram channel that Ukrainian forces struck a military target on Kronstadt, in addition to the oil terminal. His exact words, in translation, framed the operation as targeting port oil infrastructure that generates revenue for the Russian war effort, alongside a strike on Kronstadt as an important military target. Russian authorities, notably, did not confirm or deny anything regarding Kronstadt in their public statements. That silence is worth noting. When Russian officials are willing to openly admit that an oil terminal was hit, admitting 72 drones were shot down, but say absolutely nothing about a naval base being struck, it often means one of two things. Either the strike on Kronstadt didn't cause damage significant enough to require an explanation, or it caused damage significant enough that officials would rather not draw attention to it. Kronstadt has been targeted before, notably during a previous Ukrainian attack on St. Petersburg back in June, so it is clearly viewed by Kiev's military planners as a recurring point of interest. It's worth pausing here to talk about why June matters, because this attack didn't happen in a vacuum. Ukraine hit the same general area of St. Petersburg back in June, timed deliberately to coincide with Russia's flagship St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, an event where Vladimir Putin hosts foreign dignitaries, investors, and business leaders in a carefully choreographed display meant to project normalcy and economic resilience despite years of sanctions and war. Striking the city right before that forum was a symbolic move as much as a military one, a way of telling the world watching those glossy forum broadcasts that the war has not gone away just because Russian state television says otherwise. This latest attack, roughly a month later, suggests that St. Petersburg has become a recurring target rather than a one-off statement. Ukraine appears to be signaling that no Russian city, including its cultural and historical crown jewel, is beyond the reach of its long-range drone program. And the range itself deserves attention. According to Zelensky, the facilities targeted near St. Petersburg lie roughly 850 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. That is a staggering distance for what are largely low-cost, mass-produced drones to travel while evading a layered air defense network, finding their targets, and in many cases succeeding despite Russian claims of high interception rates. Even taking Russia's own figure of 72 drones intercepted at face value, the fact that any drones got through to strike an active oil terminal and reportedly a naval base means the defensive network has real gaps. Gaps that Ukraine's engineers and military planners are clearly studying and exploiting with each new wave of attacks. This is part of a broader pattern that has developed over the past year or so, where Ukrainian drone technology has become increasingly capable of penetrating what used to be considered heavily fortified airspace, including strikes deep into Moscow itself on previous occasions. Now, why is Ukraine doing this, and why now specifically? The framing coming out of Kiev is fairly consistent and has been for months. Zelensky described this latest wave as part of what he called Ukraine's long-range sanctions against Russia. That phrase is doing a lot of work rhetorically. It positions these strikes not as escalatory attacks on Russian soil, but as an economic pressure campaign, functionally similar to Western sanctions, except delivered by drone rather than by financial regulation. The logic behind targeting oil and energy infrastructure specifically is straightforward. Russia's war machine runs on oil revenue. Export earnings from crude and refined products fund a huge portion of the state budget, which in turn funds munitions, production, soldier pay, and everything else required to sustain an invasion that is now stretched into its 5th year. If Ukraine cannot match Russia in raw manpower or in traditional battlefield firepower, degrading the financial engine that sustains the war becomes an alternative theater of operations, one where drones costing a fraction of a cruise missile can inflict outsized economic damage on facilities that took years and enormous capital investment to build. This is not a new strategy for Ukraine, but it is clearly intensified. Reports indicate that attacks on Russian oil facilities have become almost a daily occurrence in recent months, creating what has been described as a genuine fuel crisis inside Russia. This is significant because it means the impact isn't purely rhetorical or symbolic anymore. It's showing up in tangible ways for ordinary Russians and for occupied territories alike. In occupied Crimea specifically, local authorities have reportedly had to suspend gasoline sales to civilians, rationing what fuel remains for military and essential services first. That is not the kind of headline any government wants circulating, because it undermines the narrative that the war is a distant, contained conflict that doesn't touch everyday life. When people can't fill up their cars in occupied Crimea, the war has arrived at their doorstep in a very concrete way. It's also worth noting the timing relative to other recent events in the war, because context helps explain why this particular strike landed the way it did in the news cycle. Just 2 days before this attack on St. Petersburg, Russia had launched what was described as its largest ever barrage on Kiev, a brutal hours-long combination of drone and missile strikes that tore open apartment buildings and killed at least 30 people, according to Kiev's own mayor. That attack on the Ukrainian capital was widely covered, drawing condemnation from Western governments and renewed calls for further military and financial support for Ukraine. Then, just 1 day before the St. Petersburg strike, on July 3rd, Vladimir Putin was shown visiting a command post of Russian forces, vowing publicly to continue what he called Moscow's campaign of large-scale missile and drone strikes against Ukrainian cities. In other words, Putin explicitly promised more of the kind of violence that had just killed 30 civilians in Kiev days earlier. Understood in that sequence, this drone strike on St. Petersburg's oil infrastructure reads less like an isolated act of Ukrainian aggression and more like an immediate tit-for-tat response, a demonstration that Ukraine has both the capability and the will to reach into Russia's own territory and hit back at economically significant targets whenever Moscow escalates against Ukrainian civilians. There's also a broader strategic theory circulating in Western and Ukrainian commentary that these attacks on Crimea and on Russian energy infrastructure are part of a deliberate effort to coerce Russia toward negotiations. The idea, as reported in various outlets, is that by inflicting significant, sustained losses on economically and militarily important targets, particularly in occupied Crimea, Ukraine hopes to raise the cost of the war to a point where the Kremlin sees ending the conflict as more attractive than continuing it. Whether or not this strategy will actually succeed in forcing Moscow to the table is a genuinely open question, one that reasonable analysts disagree on. Some argue that authoritarian regimes like Putin's are more insulated from this kind of economic pressure than democracies would be, since public discontent doesn't translate into political consequences the same way it might in a country with competitive elections and a free press. Others argue that sustained fuel shortages, damaged export infrastructure, and mounting military losses eventually erode even an authoritarian government's ability to function, regardless of whether ordinary citizens can vote anyone out of office. Both perspectives have merit, and it's simply too early to say which one will prove correct as this war continues. Now let's turn to some of the additional claims that were circulating alongside this main story, because part of doing this kind of analysis responsibly means being honest about what is confirmed versus what is still floating around as unverified chatter on social media and Telegram channels. There were reports of explosions and a secondary detonation near Kramatorsk in the Luhansk area. Secondary detonations are a term worth explaining briefly, because it comes up often in war reporting. A secondary detonation typically refers to an explosion that occurs after an initial strike, caused by ammunition, fuel, or other combustible material, stored at or near the target igniting as a delayed consequence of the first hit. When military analysts hear reports of a secondary detonation, it often suggests that whatever was struck contained a meaningful stockpile of munitions or fuel, which is one reason such reports get flagged and discussed even before they're independently confirmed. As of this reporting, however, that claim from the Luhansk area has not been independently verified by major news organizations, so it should be treated as an unconfirmed local report rather than an established fact. There were also claims of air raid sirens sounding in Chuvashia, a region considerably further east and inland than St. Petersburg, with local residents reportedly filming what they described as cruise missiles passing overhead. If accurate, this would suggest either a much broader wave of Ukrainian long-range strikes that night than the confirmed St. Petersburg and Vysotsk targets alone, or possibly Russian air defense systems engaging targets and generating their own visible missile trails that observers on the ground may have misidentified. Without independent confirmation from a credible outlet or from Ukrainian military sources acknowledging a strike in that specific region, this remains an unverified claim. It is included here not because it should be treated as established truth, but because responsible analysis means acknowledging what is circulating even while being clear about its evidentiary status. Similarly, there were reports referencing satellite fire detection data, the kind of thermal anomaly monitoring that agencies use to track wildfires and industrial fires from orbit, showing heat signatures in occupied Crimea, including near a ferry terminal used for crossing the Kerch Strait. Satellite fire detection systems are genuinely useful tools for independent verification of strikes, since they don't rely on either side's self-reporting and instead measure actual thermal signatures from space. However, these systems also pick up all kinds of heat sources, including agricultural burning, industrial activity, and non-military fires. So a thermal anomaly alone doesn't confirm a military strike without corroborating information. Again, this is worth mentioning as part of the broader picture circulating in the aftermath of the attack, but it should not be presented as confirmed fact absent further corroboration. What can be said with more confidence, because it comes from official Ukrainian military statements rather than social media chatter, is that Ukraine's security service reported striking Russian military air bases in occupied Crimea for the second time within a single week, specifically targeting the Saki air base and reportedly damaging or destroying at least 7 military aircraft. This fits into the same broader pattern already discussed, sustained, repeated pressure on Crimea specifically, both because of its military significance as a staging ground for Russian operations and because of its symbolic importance as territory annexed by Russia back in 2014. Crimea has become something of a proving ground for this strategy of attrition through repeated long-range strikes, precisely because it sits close enough to Ukrainian-controlled territory and to the Black Sea to be within reach of a wide variety of Ukrainian weapon systems, from drones to missiles to naval strike capabilities. Elsewhere in Russia, that same night, the border city of Belgorod was reportedly left almost entirely without power following overnight drone attacks, according to local media reporting. Belgorod has been a recurring target throughout the war given its proximity to the Ukrainian border, and repeated strikes on its power infrastructure fit the same broader strategy of degrading Russian logistics and quality of life in border regions that support Russian military operations, south of St. Petersburg, in the Pskov region, local officials reported that more than 30 additional drones were shot down overnight, with minor damage and injuries reported, including damage to a factory in the town of Velikiye Luki. Further afield, officials in Russia's Bryansk region and the Russian installed administration in Crimea both reported that drone strikes had killed one person in each respective region, with several more people wounded. These casualty reports, while limited in scale compared to the kind of mass casualty missile strikes Russia has inflicted on Ukrainian cities, are a reminder that this war continues to produce real human loss on both sides of the border. even in strikes primarily aimed at infrastructure rather than population centers. It's also worth mentioning that this attack did not happen in isolation from Russian actions against Ukraine on the very same day. Reports indicate that 8 people were wounded, including 2 children, after a Russian attack struck residential buildings in Ukraine's southeastern Zaporizhzhia region on that same Saturday. This is a pattern that has defined this war for years now, a near constant exchange of strikes where both sides are simultaneously absorbing and inflicting damage, making it difficult for any single day's news cycle to fully capture the scale of what's happening across such a vast and active front. Stepping back from the individual details of this particular night, it's worth asking what this attack tells us about where the war stands more broadly as it enters its 5th year. A few things stand out. First, Ukraine's ability to strike deep inside Russian territory, hundreds of kilometers from the front lines, has clearly matured into a sustained, repeatable capability rather than a rare showcase strike. The fact that St. Petersburg has now been hit multiple times in recent months, following a clear pattern of targeting oil infrastructure and occasionally military sites like Kronstadt, suggests Ukrainian military planners have both the intelligence and the hardware to keep returning to the same general area with some regularity. Second, Russian air defenses, while clearly intercepting a significant number of drones in each wave, are not able to achieve full interception, meaning that even in one of the country's most important and presumably well-defended cities, some drones are still getting through and causing real damage to critical infrastructure. Third, the economic dimension of this war, the slow, grinding pressure on Russian oil exports and fuel availability, appears to be a deliberate and increasingly central pillar of Ukrainian strategy, one that operates on a longer timeline than a single dramatic battlefield victory, but that could, over months and years, meaningfully constrain Russia's ability to sustain the war financially. At the same time, it's important to maintain some skepticism about how much any single strike, however significant, changes the overall trajectory of the war. Russia has weathered years of sanctions, sustained oil facility strikes, and enormous battlefield losses, while continuing to prosecute the war. Putin's own statement just a day before this attack, vowing to continue large-scale strikes on Ukrainian cities, is a clear signal that Moscow does not currently view its position as unsustainable, at least not publicly. Whether that public posture matches the private calculations happening inside the Kremlin is impossible to know from the outside. Authoritarian governments have strong incentives to project confidence and continuity regardless of internal strain, which means outside observers often only see cracks in the system well after they've already become serious, if they see them at all before a major shift occurs. There's also the question of how the international community, particularly Western governments supporting Ukraine, will respond to and interpret this kind of attack. Strikes on Russian territory, even ones aimed specifically at military and economic infrastructure rather than civilian population centers, have periodically generated friction between Kyiv and its Western backers, some of whom have expressed concern about escalation risks or about the optics of Western-supplied technology and intelligence potentially being used, directly or indirectly, in attacks deep inside Russian territory. Ukraine has generally maintained that its long-range strike program relies primarily on domestically developed and produced drones specifically to avoid these political complications, allowing it to conduct this kind of campaign with a degree of independence from the conditions and restrictions that sometimes accompany Western-supplied weapon systems. This distinction matters diplomatically, even if the practical battlefield effect of a drone strike is the same, regardless of where the underlying technology originated. Looking at the bigger picture of the energy dimension specifically, there's a reasonable argument that these repeated strikes on facilities like the St. Petersburg oil terminal and the Port of Vysotsk are part of a slow, cumulative campaign whose full effects won't be visible in any single day's headlines, but rather in aggregate data over months, things like reduced export volumes, higher insurance costs for tankers willing to service Russian ports, delayed loading schedules, and increased domestic fuel shortages that ripple through the broader Russian economy. Energy analysts and organizations tracking Russian oil exports have noted that this pattern of near-daily strikes on refining and export infrastructure represents a meaningful shift in how the war is being fought, moving away from purely frontline attrition and toward a broader economic siege conducted through precision long-range strikes. Whether this ultimately proves decisive in ending the war, or simply becomes another grinding feature of a conflict that has already defied predictions of quick resolution on multiple occasions, remains to be seen. For residents of St. Petersburg itself, a city of roughly 6 million people and one that has largely avoided the kind of direct, visible war impact experienced by cities much closer to the front lines, this attack, and the one preceding it in June, represent a notable shift in daily reality. St. Petersburg has long occupied a somewhat privileged position in Russian public consciousness, seen as the country's cultural and historical capital, home to the Hermitage, the site of imperial palaces, and a city that Putin himself has deep personal and political ties to. The idea that this city, specifically, is now a recurring target for Ukrainian drone strikes carries symbolic weight well beyond the physical damage caused by any individual attack. It signals to the Russian public that the war has geographically expanded in a way that touches even the country's most protected and celebrated urban centers, undermining any lingering sense that the conflict is something happening only in distant border regions or occupied territories. It's also worth touching briefly on the information environment surrounding events like this, because it shapes how the public, both inside Russia and internationally, comes to understand what actually happened. In the immediate aftermath of an attack like this, there's typically a flood of competing narratives. Pro-Ukrainian telegram channels tend to amplify claims of extensive damage, sometimes citing sources that are difficult to independently verify, framing the strike as a major success. Pro-Russian channels, meanwhile, often emphasize high interception numbers and downplay any suggestion of significant damage, framing the event as evidence of a robust and effective air defense system. Official government statements from both Kyiv and Moscow tend to fall somewhere in between these extremes, though each government obviously has its own incentives in how it characterizes the event. Russian officials have clear incentives to minimize the appearance of damage, both to avoid embarrassment and to avoid revealing information that might help Ukrainian planners refine future targeting. Ukrainian officials, meanwhile, have incentives to maximize the apparent success of their strikes, both for domestic morale purposes and to reassure international backers that military aid and intelligence cooperation are producing tangible results. Given all of this, the responsible approach to understanding any single night's events is to anchor analysis in what has actually been confirmed by identifiable officials, speaking on the record. In this case, Governor Beglov's confirmation of the strike on the Kirovsky district oil terminal, Governor Drozdenko's confirmation of the strike on the Port of Vysotsk, and President Zelensky's own confirmation of strikes on port oil infrastructure in Kronstadt. Everything beyond that core set of confirmed facts, the claims about Luhansk secondary detonations, sirens in Chuvashia, satellite thermal anomalies in Crimea, should be treated as circulating reports rather than established truth until further corroboration emerges from credible, verifiable sources in the days that follow. As for what comes next, history over the past several years of this war suggests a fairly predictable pattern will play out. Russian state media will likely provide selective updates on repair and restoration efforts at the affected facilities, framing any disruption as minor and quickly resolved, consistent with the Kremlin's broader strategy of projecting resilience and normalcy, regardless of underlying reality. Independent energy analysts and organizations tracking satellite imagery and shipping data will likely produce more detailed assessments over the following days and weeks, potentially revealing a clearer picture of the actual damage and how long the affected facilities remain offline or operating at reduced capacity. Ukrainian officials will likely continue to reference this strike as part of their broader narrative of sustained pressure on Russian energy infrastructure, particularly if similar attacks continue at the near-daily pace that has been reported in recent months. And the cycle of mutual strikes, Ukrainian long-range attacks on Russian energy and military infrastructure, met with continued Russian missile and drone bombardment of Ukrainian cities, shows no sign of abating as this war moves deeper into its fifth year, with neither side currently showing public willingness to pursue the kind of negotiated settlement that would bring this grinding, mutually destructive pattern to an end. It's worth spending a bit more time on the drone technology itself, because the story of this war, at least on the long-range strike side of things, is increasingly a story about cheap, mass-producible hardware achieving effects that used to require expensive, exquisite weapon systems. The drones involved in strikes like this one are generally understood to be a mix of fixed-wing, propeller-driven long-range attack drones, built with relatively low-cost components, carrying modest explosive payloads compared to a cruise missile, but capable of flying enormous distances at low altitude to avoid radar detection. What they lack in individual destructive power, they make up for in sheer numbers and in cost efficiency. A single cruise missile can cost well over $1 million to produce, while a long-range attack drone of the kind Ukraine has been using might cost a small fraction of that. When you're launching dozens of these at a single target complex, as appears to have happened here with 72 drones reportedly engaged over the Leningrad region alone, the economics start to favor the attacker in a meaningful way, especially against a defender who has to intercept every single one to avoid any damage at all, while the attacker only needs a handful to get through to claim a tactical success. This asymmetry, cheap, mass-produced drones against expensive layered air defense systems, has become one of the defining features of this war's later years, and it's part of why Western militaries and defense analysts have been watching Ukraine's drone program so closely, viewing it as something of a live laboratory for how future conflicts might be fought. Traditional air defense systems, the kind Russia has deployed extensively around cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, were largely designed in an earlier era to intercept a smaller number of higher-value, higher-speed threats like ballistic missiles or manned aircraft. They were not necessarily designed with the expectation that an adversary might launch 70 or more low and slow drones at once, forcing defenders to expend expensive interceptor missiles against comparatively cheap targets. A cost-exchange ratio that heavily favors whoever's doing the attacking over time, even if the defender technically wins each individual engagement by shooting the drone down before it reaches its target. There's also a psychological and political dimension to this drone campaign that shouldn't be overlooked. Every successful strike, or even every strike that Russian officials are forced to publicly acknowledge, chips away at the narrative the Kremlin has worked hard to maintain domestically. The idea that the war is proceeding according to plan, that Russian territory is secure, and that the special military operation, as it's still officially termed in Russian state messaging, remains a contained and manageable undertaking far from ordinary Russian life. When a governor has to go on Telegram and confirm that drones hit an oil terminal in a major city, that is, whether intended or not, an admission that the war has arrived somewhere it was never supposed to reach. Multiply that admission across dozens of similar statements from regional governors over the preceding months, covering everything from Moscow to Belgorod to Pskov to St. Petersburg itself, and you start to see a cumulative erosion of the sense of insulation that Russian civilians in major cities have generally enjoyed compared to those living near the front lines or in occupied territories. It's also useful to think about this attack through the lens of what military analysts sometimes call cost imposition strategy. Rather than aiming for a single decisive knockout blow against Russian energy infrastructure, which would likely be operationally impossible given the sheer scale and redundancy of Russia's oil and gas sector, Ukraine appears to be pursuing a strategy of continuous distributed pressure. Hit one refinery this week, an export terminal the next, a storage depot the week after that, never allowing repair crews and logistics planners a moment of sustained calm to fully restore capacity before the next disruption arrives. Over time, this kind of campaign doesn't need any single strike to be catastrophic to be effective. It needs the cumulative effect of dozens or hundreds of smaller disruptions to add up to a meaningful drag on Russian oil export revenue and domestic fuel availability, functioning almost like a slow leak rather than a single dramatic rupture. Given how frequently these attacks have reportedly been occurring, described by multiple outlets as almost a daily occurrence, it seems clear this is exactly the model Ukraine's military planners have settled on. There is a counter-argument worth acknowledging here as well, one that skeptics of this strategy raise fairly consistently. Russia's oil and gas sector is enormous, spanning multiple regions, dozens of major refineries, and an extensive pipeline and export infrastructure network built up over decades of Soviet and post-Soviet investment. Even sustained near-daily drone strikes on individual facilities may only ever dent a small percentage of overall national production and export capacity, particularly if Russia is able to prioritize repairs at the most economically critical sites, while accepting temporary disruption at others. Critics of the strategy point out that despite years of sanctions, price caps, and now this sustained drone campaign, Russia has continued to find buyers for its oil, often through intermediary countries, and the aforementioned shadow fleet of tankers operating outside traditional Western-aligned insurance and shipping networks. From this perspective, the drone campaign, while certainly costly and disruptive for Russia in a narrow sense, may not be sufficient on its own to force the kind of strategic reassessment in Moscow that would lead to serious negotiations, absent other forms of pressure working in parallel, including continued Western financial sanctions, battlefield losses, and diplomatic isolation. Supporters of the strategy would counter that the goal was never for drone strikes alone to end the war in isolation, but rather to serve as one component of a broader, multi-pronged pressure campaign, working alongside sanctions, battlefield attrition, and diplomatic efforts to gradually raise the cost of continuing the war for the Kremlin to the point where domestic political and economic pressures make continuation less attractive than a negotiated resolution. Under this view, judging any single component of the strategy, including the drone campaign against oil infrastructure, in isolation misses the point. The relevant question isn't whether drone strikes alone can end the war, but whether they meaningfully contribute to the broader accumulation of pressure that, combined with everything else, eventually shifts Moscow's calculus. Reasonable people looking at the same set of facts can and do disagree about how much weight to place on each component of that broader pressure campaign, and about how close, if at all, Russia currently is to any kind of breaking point. One more dimension worth touching on before wrapping up is how this fits into the pattern of the war's fifth year more broadly, a period that has been characterized by a kind of grinding continuity rather than dramatic turning points. Front lines in the eastern part of Ukraine have shifted only incrementally in recent months, with Russian forces making slow, costly territorial gains in some sectors, while Ukrainian forces hold firm or occasionally counterattack in others. Meanwhile, the long-range strike war, conducted largely away from the traditional front lines, using drones and missiles rather than infantry and armor, has become an increasingly important secondary theater. one where the balance of capability and initiative has shifted more dynamically than the static ground war. Ukraine's growing drone strike capability against deep Russian targets represents one of the few areas of the conflict where Kiev can credibly claim to be gaining relative advantage over time, even as the ground war remains largely stalemated. This asymmetry, a grinding, largely static ground conflict paired with an increasingly dynamic and expanding long-range strike campaign, may end up being one of the defining structural features of how historians eventually characterize this period of the war, whenever it does eventually come to an end. Ultimately, this attack on St. Petersburg's oil terminal and the Port of Vysotsk fits within a larger, well-documented Ukrainian strategy of using long-range drone strikes to impose sustained economic costs on Russia's warfighting capacity, targeting the energy infrastructure that funds the invasion rather than attempting to match Russia in a purely conventional frontline military contest. It may be less equipped to win outright. Whether this strategy ultimately succeeds in bringing Russia to a negotiating table or simply becomes one more feature of a war whose end remains difficult to predict will depend on factors that extend well beyond any single night strikes, including the sustainability of Western support for Ukraine, the internal resilience or fragility of the Russian economy under sustained pressure, and the political calculations of leaders on both sides who, as of this moment, appear committed to continuing rather than ending this conflict.